The sun goes down, the stars come out, and all that counts is here and now. My universe will never be the same. I'm glad you came. I'm glad you came.
You are listening to ParaMania Radio.
I'm just so happy my father had a chance to see his kids before he passed. I just want to say thank you.
When her father fell ill, the American Red Cross was able to help get Veronica's brother home from the Navy to speak to his father one last time. It's thanks to your donations that we can connect military families when they need it most. Please donate today at redcross.org.
Buy it, use it, break it, fix it, trash it, change it, mail, upgrade it, charge it, point it, zoom it, press it, snap it, work it, quick erase it, write it, cut it, paste it, save it, load it, check it, quick rewrite it, plug it, play it, burn it, rip it, drag it, drop it, zip unzip it, lock it, fill it, call it, find it, view it.
The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual hosts and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of ParaMania, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
You are listening to ParaMania Radio.
Journey through the world of parapsychology by exploring the human mind, the spiritual realm, and all the unlocked doors of the universe. Welcome to The Skeleton Key.
Watching her strolling in the night, so white, wondering why it's only after dawn.
Now the host of The Skeleton Key, Paranormal Sarah.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to ParaMania Radio's The Skeleton Key with me, your host, Paranormal Sarah, or Sarah Soderlund, depending on which world you live in. And I'm going to cut right to the chase tonight. We have a wonderful guest. I'm really excited, and I was kind of laughing just moments before the show went live that I've never actually had a conversation with this man. And this man is kind of one of those people in my life that people are always like, you know, after an hour's worth of conversation or whiskey or both, they're like, you need to talk to John Tenney. Have you ever talked to John Tenney? Do you know John Tenney? And this name, it's like this mythical creature. It's like a cryptozoological expedition of my own. And he's joining us tonight. John Tenney is on the line. John, are you there?
I'm here.
You do exist.
At least I seem to sometimes.
I think maybe you might. Maybe you do. Yes. No, you do, and I'm so excited because this is terribly true. You know, a good friend. We have a lot of mutual friends, and some of which are those people that just, you know, those are just those top 10 people that are just the coolest people ever. Amy Bruni Beardsley, a friend of mine. She does Strange Escapes, and we had her on the show recently, and talking about her amazing Strange Escapes adventures, and you've been on these, and you're one of those people that she brings in to this small circle of awesomeness, and has always recommended a conversation. So, I know that was just kind of rhetorical, maybe. But I'm excited. And I want people who maybe are joining us and are not familiar with who you are. Who are you? Give me a brief bio of who John Tenney, or the man. Oh, wait. Is he there? I think he dropped. I think we're going to have to recall him on the line. Well, anyway, I'll give him a little introduction and we'll see how that goes. John Tenney is one of those...
There we go.
Sorry, John. Man, you
are
in a storm.
It's very stormy in Michigan.
Okay. Well, if you have to duck and roll and find your lowest spot, let us know. Otherwise,
I've actually gone up into a higher spot. I've gone upstairs to get a better reception on my phone to see if that works.
Oh no, near-death experiences for the show. I love it.
Yep, anything for the show.
That's dedication, people. That's show business. Well, no, I wanted to, just before you dropped, I wanted you to kind of give everyone listening a brief bio about who John is.
Sure. I started out researching and investigating political assassinations of the 1960s and 70s in the mid-'80s. By the 90s, I had switched to more supernatural, metaphysical, anomalistic phenomena and worked on unsolved mysteries as a researcher for a few years, and then sightings and all the weird kind of shows that were going on in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, obviously, paranormal reality shows kicked off, and so every now and then I would get hit up for information, and that's how I became friends with everybody that you're friends with.
Huh. That is so fascinating to me. It just, and I really
the briefest bio I've ever given.
Well, that's good. No, because I think it's still a little mysterious, but it's kind of like a peach. You know, it's got this soft outer shell now. I kind of feel like I know what I'm working with. And what would you say, because there's a lot in there that I want to attack right away, but what would you say is your education? What is your area of expertise? Is it kind of being a generalized, efficient researcher, or is it...
Yeah, when I figured out what I wanted to do, I wanted to be a history teacher at a certain point. And while doing that was right in the late 80s, early 90s when I started to go to college. And there was just something about wanting to disseminate information to people. But then it became, while taking the courses and classes to do that, realizing that I wasn't going to be able to disseminate the information that I thought needed to be heard by people. I was going to be basically teaching people what, is taught in schools. And so then I switched more to folklore and why do people believe what they believe. And that led to switching to wanting to be a psychology major. And then that's when Unsolved Mysteries came in, and they needed someone who could research and archive, so I left school and just became an archivist. I became a researcher who collected and compiled information and looked for correlating data, and it just kind of spun naturally out of control after that.
Okay. So that's really, really fascinating. I love the mix of, and I can totally see that too, because when you go to like weirdlectures.com, I believe. Is it weirdlectures.com? And I was kind of reading through your articles today, which you're a wonderful writer, and knowing that you also give lectures, that you kind of are going back to this passionate roots of, wanting to teach people. You use the verb inseminate, which I thought was kind of interesting, information to people. And I'm kind of wondering if you consider yourself a conspiracy theorist, or if you kind of fall victim to that struggle of what a curriculum and what society and what conforming does, and having to step out of that.
Yeah, absolutely. My mentor he is a teacher, a history teacher, and he specializes. He was the one who really took me under his wing and taught me how to do research, and his specialty was political assassinations of the 60s and 70s. And that's really where I kind of began to understand that there was this entire history that was never talked about. People will talk about JFK, Robert, RFK, MLK, Malcolm X, but they don't talk so much about all of the members of the Black Panther Party that were killed, or the shootings at Kent State. That there were all of these other histories that get mentioned, but they don't ever become ingrained in the history that people learn. And that fascinated me. And I do consider myself a conspiracy theorist. I don't have any problem with that linguistically. I mean, I theorize about conspiracies. And so I have no problem with being called a conspiracy theorist. That's another thing that I think that you, from what I know about you and what I've read about you and talked to our mutual friends about you, is language is very important. And, you know, the fact that, you know, conspiracy theorist has become a word that somehow coincides with someone who's a wacko or a lunatic. I mean, a conspiracy theorist is like a theoretical physicist. It's the same thing. There are physics, and there are people who theorize it. There are conspiracies, and there are people who theorize about it. One is a scientist, one is a nutcase, and yet the language is exactly the same.
Yeah. No. Yes. And I love listening and to you kind of speak about it, because I think you give an interesting perspective, and I'm interested to know maybe what perspective is for you when talking with, for example, tonight's topic or theme that I was going to try and stay on, if I can ever get out of your mind, is attachments and, you know, possession, attachments, negative side effects to the paranormal. And
Sure.
for me, that I always have to break down the linguistics of what I'm talking about with a person, and I try and portray that on the show about, you know, if I say attachment, what does that mean? You know, it's very unlikely that myself and my client, or myself and a coworker, or myself and any other person would truly be defining that in the same way. You know, it's just impossible, because we do so much based on experience and personal experience.
Absolutely.
And so perspective, you know, I remember doing paranormal conventions, and I'm not always the most popular booked, because I want to do lectures on things like Gestalt psychology and,
Right.
you know, how are we storing information? And I love it, because typically those lectures that do squeak by and I do get to do, the crowd, by the end of it, you have a handful of people that come up and they're like, oh, this was great and, you know, wonderful and yada, yada. And then you have those few that stay till the very end, and they kind of walk up slowly and they say, okay, I've been thinking about this perspective for a long time. And, you know, they go into this whole theory that they have, and it's this personal experience for them, because it really speaks to perspective. So I'm interested in what you think about that, because you had kind of mentioned that, you know, even with the linguistics of conspiracy theorists, you're either a wacko or, you know, society's labeled you some deviant, crazy person. But really, when you just break it down, we all have done it, you know,
Yeah,
500,000 times.
And you're absolutely like, when I start my lectures, always start the same way. I ask a series of questions. One of the and they're very simple questions. Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe in UFOs? Do you believe in Bigfoot? It's just the questions that I ask. And then after I ask those questions, you know, I do point out the fact, because I'll say, how many people here to Ghost Conference? Obviously, I say, how many people here believe in ghosts? And everyone raises their hands. But then immediately I point out that everyone there has a different idea of what a ghost is. None of us have decided at the lecture beforehand what that word is going to mean, what it's going to represent, and yet we've all raised our hands in agreement. And that's a big problem in the paranormal community in general. We've never agreed as a community as to what the words mean. And
Right.
if we're going to have deep philosophical discussions on the nature of existence and does consciousness persist after biological death, whenever you have a philosophical conversation, the first thing you have to have is a very boring conversation about what your words are going to mean. That way everybody can be on the same page. And we've never had that as a community.
Right. You know, and it's I just love it. I love that I'm on a yes train, because that doesn't always happen typically with me. But it's nice when it does. And I think linguistically, you know, terminology, it's like you said, that boring part of, you know, the textbook, that you go back to the bold words and you look at their definitions, and then you flip back to the chapter and you're like, okay, now this makes sense. And we kind of do that naturally, but somehow it's dissolved in this community that I think people run to out of personal experience. So you've got someone who they want to contact their Uncle Bob that was murdered, you know, heinously in a crime, and they think that he's trying to, you know, speak from the grave about his injustice. And the other person, it's, you know, hope and salvation because they're in stage 4 cancer and they weren't raised in a religious household, that maybe their soul goes somewhere, and it's a very unanswered question. And these two people are going to the same lecture and you ask, do you believe in a ghost? And so I think you're absolutely right. There's just been no terminology, and it's, the skepticism when you have to sit down and say, okay, this is what I mean, and yada, yada, and this is what I mean, and this is, that. People kind of think that systematic methodology or that boringness, that's a little too scientific.
I've tried to couch it to as much as I can to reach the widest audience possible. I have a slogan which I always say: diversify your weirdness. Like I put that on my stickers and stuff, because I think that one of the things that I mention at my lectures is when I was working on Unsolved Mysteries in the 90s and we were talking about alien abductions. Alien abductions were sleep paralysis, whispering voices, shadow figures, balls of light. And over the years, because of the way popular media is, because we've never had the discussion of what words mean or what situations are, those experiences became demonic possessions. They're the exact same experience, they have the exact same identities, and yet they've become two separate things. And so where does one thing end? Where does one thing begin? And what is being misunderstood? And again, the perception of the experiencer is making the judgment call on it.
I love that, because I instantly start thinking of scenarios where maybe someone is listening to you say that and they don't quite understand what that might mean for someone. And so I think of, say, for example, you do have someone who they grew up born in 1976 and graduated in 93, and they are an Unsolved Mysteries fan, and they grew up in that genre, and alien abduction and the communion and so many things have molded their, maybe a sleep disorder, maybe it may be sexual abuse. It may be a projection of something completely different. It may be that just a show that they watched, that it's a false memory. Whatever it is, they've molded it as an alien abduction. And maybe now they go to a convention and they learn, like you had said, that the symptoms are terribly similar to Maria over here, who's a devout Catholic. And she's been told since she was 13, who maybe has the same sleep disorder, that she is possessed. And she's been exorcised many times, and she's been isolated by her community, and and she's struggling in the same way, but the perception runs really deep for what might be the cause and what might be the cure and what might be the answer. And so trying to theorize sometimes can be terribly difficult, because some people's roots are instilled in a value like religion that you can't easily undo, and maybe shouldn't undo. What do you think about that? Do you think that it's a good thing to unleash some of those values and, extend, or is it better for some people to stay focused?
It's a great, difficult question. For someone like me, I was raised in a completely non-religious household. I was never made to go to church. There was a Bible in my house, but there was also a Quran in my house. There was a Tao Te Ching in my house. And I was always told, if you have questions, there's a kid down the street who goes to Catholic school, ask him. There's a Jewish kid down the street who goes to synagogue, ask him. And so it's strange for me, because I feel like with a lot of people who were brought up with a Judeo-Christian religion specifically, there's this idea of when you say God, even if they don't forward think it, there's an unconsciousness of like a large man that might be in the back of their mind, because that's how they originally understood it as a child when it was understood by them. When I think about God, because it wasn't instilled in me at a very young age, when I hear the word, there's an unconsciousness in the back of, an unconscious thought in the back of my head of, and the best way I've ever been able to describe it is an energy river. Like that's the first thing I think about, is this big tidal wave of energy that flows. And so I do think it's hard to unwrap people's belief systems. I don't know if it's always a good idea. I've always stated that I don't really believe anything, and I don't even know if I believe that. But it's the hardest part of being a researcher and doing what we do is pulling yourself out of the mix. I've had hundreds of strange experiences over the past 28 years that seem to be unexplainable to me, and when they're happening, they are absolutely 100% real. But the moment that they're over, the other part of my brain kicks in and goes through problem solving and figuring out what was it. How does it exist in reality that I understand? How could it possibly manifest in reality that I understand? And I think that sometimes people do get a little too locked up in their belief systems. I think it's a good thing to want to be a good person. I don't know if it's so difficult, isn't it?
I have to interrupt because that's probably one of the most profound examples that a guest has ever had on the show that I think, at least for me, because you're a very kinesthetic and visual person. For those listening that often listen to the show, I'm always kind of profiling your learning channel. And when you speak, you're always speaking in future tense or past tense, and you're always using verbs and touchy-feely linguistics, and it's verbs. It's, you're in it. And I like that. And you had mentioned, what do you think of when you think of God? And that for most, let's, put up our little quotey fingers, Christian, Catholic, right, Methodist, Lutheran, whatever, Judeo-Christian beliefs, that immediately, unconsciously, subconsciously, we think of like Zeus, like that big old man. Yeah. Because he's always referenced as he in the verbal, which for those of us who are indoctrinated by religion, I do say indoctrinated because it's the most brilliant use of learning conditioning that you're ever going to find. It's why societies and governments use it. But you are reading something, you are hearing something, sometimes you're even singing something in repetition and sing-song. I mean, you are being molded. And I will raise my hand. God to me looks like a little Hercules Zeus in the sky on a cloud. Of course, he looks more and more like George Carlin every day, but he is a man, and trying to take that away I don't think that subliminally or unconsciously you ever could. So I just have to know that about myself. It's so strange with belief systems, because when people ask me, I recently had someone heard me on a radio show, and I said that I didn't believe in ghosts. And this person heard me say that on a radio show and wrote a huge article about me about. But you were on Ghost Stalkers, and you've been on all these paranormal shows, and how can that be?
Exactly, and they wrote an article about what a BS artist I am, because how can I be on a ghost show or help work on ghost shows or do ghost conventions if I don't believe in ghosts? And they were missing the point, is that I have a endless myriad of ideas about ghosts, but I don't have a belief system of them, because a belief system is radically difficult, if possible, to change. A belief is a belief. It's concrete. An idea is flexible. It changes. It's allowed to bend. And I have, like I said, I have a countless amount of ideas about them, but I don't have a belief in them. I'm always willing to change my ideas. And I think that's a really good but difficult place to stand in this community.
Well, absolutely, because think about, for example, for those of you listening, think about, let's stay on topic, about a demonic possession. Someone contacts you. They've seen you on television. They've heard that you're someone to contact, and they believe that they have been possessed, or that they have an attachment, or that something evil is in their life, and they don't know how to get rid of it. And that's literally what they say to you at that point. What is your case of action, being someone who isn't going to believe right away necessarily in demonic or evil? Or do you? Because those are kind of religious terms.
Yeah, so one of the stories that I tell at my lectures, and if you'll let me tell it, even if it may be boring for those who have heard it before, but one of the stories I tell is a husband and a wife contacted me a long time ago because they thought that there was an evil demon in their house. And I went through my protocol. By the time I got to their house, I was talking to them, and while I was talking to them, a screen door was kicked out. There were plates and cups that were thrown all over. A window was broken. I was scratched. The woman I was talking to was bit, and I left. And I left because their children were terrible. All of those things had been done by their children. Now, their children were not evil. Their children wanted someone to pay attention to them. Their children wanted someone to recognize that they were there. Their children had something to say and weren't being heard. And it's difficult enough in this human condition that we're in. It's difficult enough to understand what another person sitting across the table from you, what their motive and means are. And you can talk to them and see them. To make a judgment call on whether or not something is evil, and you can't see it. You can't speak to it directly. It can't speak to you directly. To put the judgment call on it that it's one thing or another seems like madness to me. Everyone is fine, and I say this too at my lectures, everyone is fine sitting in a room because you can get up and leave the room anytime you want. If you were in the room for 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 100 years, you would probably become lonely, feel isolated, frustrated, angry, and you might manifest enough energy to finally reach out and touch someone. And when you do, it creates a mark on them that looks as if it's a scratch, and then the person would think that they were attacked. I mean, these are concepts that we have to wrestle with as investigators and researchers, that the judgment calls that we're putting on things, I really don't know if I believe in evil at all, but to make the judgment call that something is evil, I think is kind of falderal.
Well, I think, okay, so there's two things. There's kind of a deeper one, and there's kind of a surface one question that evolves from that, because I love the direction that you're going, and I hope those of you listening are calling a friend and texting another friend, but still listening, still actively listening, but bringing as many people as you can to this conversation, because I think it's important what he's saying. But one, I'm a little embarrassed, well, maybe not so much, to admit I'm a visual person, and so growing up in the 80s, when I think of things moving, I don't think poltergeist unless it's a creepy man or like tree branches strangling me. Instead, I think of Patrick Swayze and the Ghost and them having that conversation in the subway about kicking the can.
Mm-hmm.
And having to conjure energy in a way and to do so much just for a small, quantum change,
right.
to have emotional energy be the only thing affecting something physical and matter, that it's a different scale than we can comprehend.
Absolutely.
Unless we are really thinking thinking out there. So I love that. Just for those of you, I just love that you had mentioned that. And I would love to go into like the confinements of time, and if you think, a spirit is in time, but that's a whole nother radio show, but we won't go there. But maybe something simple, like some people in the chat room, some of the questions have been, cold cases, people that die, and murders that just get lost, that just kind of dissolve into time. What maybe are things that you've learned in your research that are certain symptoms? Like, to me, something moving may not necessarily be poltergeist, whereas a strange, mathematical, ridiculous stacking of something, I would probably think like alien first. And I, of course, have my perception of why, but I'm wondering what you would think first and why.
It really is one of those situations where a lot of the times I've seen similar things happen, and the result seems to be something completely different. So I really do think it comes down to a case-by-case basis. I think that lumping all of these things together into one process, into one happening, into one experience, does a disservice to the larger combinatorial system that we're dealing with.
So maybe all cattle mutilations or a cattle mutilation is not necessarily alien.
For sure. even to look at just what we know about, talk about possessions, just what we know about possessions.
What do you know about possession?
So something that you may not know, and I talk about not in too great a detail because I have a non-disclosure agreement, but in 1999, I was invited through the Archdiocese of Detroit to sit in on an exorcism. So that was a real weird changer for me to sit in on that. But when you look at possession overall, the larger scope of it, if you look at it historically, we do know now that some possessions, and what were called possessions, were things that were mental aberrations in people. They were inborn desires, especially at a time when religious systems were so ingrained in people. When you look at things like the Devils of Loudun in France with Urban Grandier, a lot of that was a very handsome priest being put in charge of nuns, and the nuns all of a sudden having sexually exciting dreams because of this handsome priest, and they must obviously be possessed because otherwise they wouldn't be having these dreams. And if you read the diaries of the nuns that were kept, they talk about the fact that all of a sudden they didn't want to keep their vows of chastity anymore, and it must be because of the priest that was put in charge with them. Or there was a book, I mean, that's back in 1600 or 16th century, but you can look into the book. There's a book that came out in the 1970s called Operators and Other Things, which was about a clinical psychologist who in her mid-30s started to experience dissociative personalities, and she at first thought that she was possessed. And she kept track of who she was in contact with, how they contacted her, how they were influencing her. One looked like the devil, but she was looking at it from the point of view of a clinical psychologist who understood what was happening. And even though she understood what was happening, she still thought that she was being possessed when she was going through those states of disassociation with herself. So we know that some possessions over time have been explainable, but when you get into possessions that don't seem to be explainable, and the exorcism that I sat in on, when the Vatican sponsors an exorcism, there is a months-long process making sure that the person doesn't have a mental disorder, that they're not addicted to drugs, that they're not an alcoholic, or they might be an alcoholic, but that's not the cause of the possession itself. They don't just rush into the scene and do a possession because someone says, I think I'm possessed. They've been doing it for hundreds of years, and they've got it methodically down. And it's a very, very strange process. I would be willing to say that what most people have seen as real exorcisms on television shows, on documentaries, was nothing like what I experienced. And the priest and assisting priest who were there doing the actual exorcism in our breakdown after the exorcism was over, told me kind of outrightly that you will never see an actual Catholic exorcism on television because it would be psychologically damaging to such a huge portion of society to actually see it going on.
Because it is more grandiose than what even Hollywood illustrates?
Because it's more psychologically jarring. Not that someone is spitting pea soup or their head is spinning around or they're climbing up walls, but to watch a human being restrained, reverting back to an animal that's trapped, and watching two people very coldly and calculatedly not pay attention to that and go through a kind of weird methodical ritual, I think would not do a great service to the Catholic Church.
Interesting. Okay, well, that is a huge mouthful for me that I'm excited to explore. And for those of you listening, I'm going to give you a breather. We're going to take our first break of the evening here with our guest, John Tenney. And so after the break, join us live as we talk more here on the Skeleton Key.
There is us
it, scroll it, pose it, click it, cross it, crack it, switch, update it, name it, read it.
If you want to learn about how paranormal investigators use technology, what we use, and how it works, then check out Tech Time with Brock and Doc every Sunday at 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific. Only on the ParaMania Radio Network.
If you served honorably in our nation's armed forces and you're looking for a way to continue serving your fellow veterans in your community, then join AMVETS. Each year, AMVETS members volunteer millions of hours at VA healthcare facilities from coast to coast, helping to improve the lives of their fellow veterans through the VA Voluntary Services Program. AMVETS posts and departments also participate in a wide variety of community service projects ranging from Americanism in our schools to supporting the Special Olympics and Boy Scouts of America. If you no longer wear the uniform today, you can still serve through the AMVETS by joining today at amvets.org.
Do you like ghost stories? Want to hear about some of the haunted homes and locations that I've investigated? Tune in for the latest in paranormal news and guest interviews with me, Mr. Haunted, on the Haunted Chronicles, Friday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific, only on the ParaMania Radio Network.
Hello, this is Dusty Hill ZZ Top. According to HUD, over 60,000 American veterans sleep abandoned and forgotten on our nation's streets, where they've been beaten, robbed, even killed. Yet if this happened behind enemy lines, we wouldn't stand for it. Veterans matter. We must take care of our own. Please join our 60,000 Soldiers campaign to get these warriors back into housing and recapture their lives. To learn more about our 60,000 Soldiers campaign, visit veteransmatter.org.
If you would like to be kept up to date on upcoming show information and events here on ParaMania Radio, then please take the time to click on the like button above the chat room to like our Facebook page. And click on follow to follow us on Twitter. Thank you for listening to ParaMania Radio.
You are listening to ParaMania Radio.
In my heart, the deep and dark
We now return to the Skeleton Key, hosted by Paranormal Sarah.
and wait for after dark.
And welcome back, everyone, to ParaMania Radio. Tonight on the Skeleton Key, we have who's turning out to be, I think, one of my favorite guests. Amy, if you're listening, I'm sorry. Mr. John Tenney, who the whole first half really allowed us to step into his mind and into his perspective of the paranormal and where he comes from. And I really get this exciting visual of the kind of person that's coming to the table. And during the break, he had asked me if I was an NLP person. And I always get excited when someone even knows what that means and that it's not a chronic illness. And so I then realized, that we confirmed that we met briefly at Mid-South 3 years ago.
3 years ago.
But I had just pooped out a baby, so who knows what was going through my mind at that time. Who really knows? Because that was in August, and it was in Kentucky. I remember this.
Yeah,
yes.
I think the reason that we met so briefly is because you were surrounded by people loving you because you had just had your baby.
Right, and they just really wanted to be around a baby is what it was really about. They're like, oh, look at a baby. Right, yeah, everybody knows that. And, of course, the worst thing I could have ever done, I was a new mom, and here I have an 8-week-old baby. Let's put them near a bunch of paranormal people who knows if they wash their hands, right? We don't know. But I did, and so that happened, and that's when we met. But I have no idea what you know of me, and for those of you listening, because our chat room has doubled, so I know that you have all of your fans here, John.
Very nice.
That, for me, I kind of am always working against the clock. I'm a little younger, a generation, just a tad bit behind you. I'm more of a Depeche Mode generation, but I am a forensic psychologist. And I'm working towards my doctorate in clinical psychology with a specialty in neurolinguistics and cognitive behavioral therapy. And I work with psychopathy is what my dissertation is about. I am hoping to be recruited again by the FBI. They recruited me 2 years ago, but I had just had a baby and I didn't feel like it was the best time to leave for 10 weeks and go to Quantico, but it was my dream. I kind of had a personal moment and yada yada, and that's like a whole book that I could write someday. But now I'm hoping to get back to that place that I would go back and work for a government entity, doing profiling and doing mental assessments and treatment for psychopathy. And I love anything from, divination and palmistry and iridology and all these folklorish cultural ways of profiling people, even if it's phrenology and it's kind of ridiculous and it's a Quaker thing. I'm always interested in mental health and how it's evolved. And it's interesting that I think mental health has always paralleled a little bit with spirituality. For those belief systems that are trying to explain what's happening when they're having multiple personalities, that there's more than one person trapped in them. And so you illustrate this and you can imagine it can be a glorious story, and it's a horrific emotional one. So it's very colorful. And some of the stories you read in the Bible, I think, are depicting mental illness. But that's my perspective.
Well, I think that's your perspective is pretty dead on. I think that one of the things that fascinates me the most and gets lost in this modern day Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat world, when we kind of forget the history of paranormal researchers, is we forget, in the 1800s when it was actually being studied by scholarly individuals in England, when Psychical Research Society was looking into it. It was from the work of people like the Sedgwicks and William James and all of these Edmund Gurney and Myers. It was by the study of the mechanistic properties of the brain, psychiatry and psychology was born out of those things. They started to understand recovered memories and lost memories and multiple personalities. And the soft sciences, if you will, of psychology and psychiatry were born out of paranormal researchers who were openly and honestly engaged in trying to figure out what is consciousness, what is thinking, what are the properties of human nature. And we, as paranormal researchers and investigators, are the children from these great scholarly thinkers, and we oftentimes forget that.
Do you believe in past lives?
I don't believe in anything, Sarah.
But you don't even believe in that, John.
I know. I don't.
Well, then tell me this.
Yeah.
So visually in your mind, you have a tally mark, like a scoreboard, like a football game, right? And on one side, you have explainable, empirical, real.
Right.
And on the other side, the opposing team is unexplainable.
Right.
When you had the opportunity to witness that exorcism, what point went where?
It's a good question, right? So you have that scoreboard with two sides, and it's like making a horizontal line through from one side to the other. There were a lot of things that I saw and experienced which were completely explainable as a person going through a psychotic break or an emotional break. But there were other things that I experienced that didn't seem to make any sense. A person, the client who I had been informed about their past history and knowing that they had a limited education and watching them begin to speak multiple languages, which again, I could sit and say that, if they had at some point in their life watched a movie that had been subtitled, their brain had recorded the information of the language from that movie that they watched, and they were calling it up at a time of stress and disorder. So, I mean, I think for me, when you talk about the scoreboard of what's real and what's not, what's explainable and what's not, I love science. Science gives me the ability to talk to you on the phone. It gives me the ability to travel all over the world, fly in planes, drive cars, heat up food. That's all science. It works very well. my problem is we now live in a world where science became stranger than paranormal ideas. That science, at some point in the mid to late 80s, the math, physics, the grandfather of all science, which was always correct to a dozen places after the decimal point, always worked, seemed to stop working. And so scientists created dark matter and dark energy, which is a hypothetical construct, which, if anyone wants to look it up and read up on it, scientists, theoretical physicists will tell you dark matter and dark energy comprises 96% of all known matter and energy. That means that science, the thing that tells us what's real and what's not, only understands 4% of our universe. That's a very low number. If I walked into a job interview tomorrow and told them I could do this job 4%, I would not get that job. And so the unreality of reality is where my scoreboard is.
Where did it go, John? Where did the point go?
Where did the what go?
Where did the point go when you witnessed that exorcism? Did it go in reality or unreality?
It went into reality. It went into reality in the sense that I was there, I experienced it, I saw it happening. Now that point has moved over to unreality because it's in my past. I don't have a lot of proof that it happened. I mean, I have my little letter from the Vatican thanking me for assisting. I have my memories of it. I know my memories are faulty. I know that I'm not properly remembering it anymore because it was almost, it was 1999, so it was a decade ago or more. So that point shifts back and forth. Did I lose you?
No. I'm trying to think of the next question that I want to, if I want to be selfish or not. If I want to stay to the topic for the listeners, or if I want to ask you a question for myself. I think I'll be selfish. So my next question would be, just psychologically speaking, have you ever served in the military or been desensitized in some way?
I haven't served in the military. I did not ever serve in the military. The desensitizing of me comes through the fact that, and again, I know that you and I have never talked, and I don't expect you to know my history, but when I was a teenager, I died. And so that's where the desensitizing comes from, is I had cardiac arrest.
Experience.
Yes, I had cardiac arrest when I was a teenager and flatlined for a few minutes and came back. And because of that, there's not only a certain amount of PTSD that will always reside within me, but there's also a kind of hyper-awareness that goes along with that PTSD, which makes me very hypersensitive to everything that's going on all the time. And so because of the hypersensitivity, there's a desensitizing of a lot of what's around me.
Would you say you're psychic?
Not any more than anyone else.
What is a psychic?
A person who is aware of all of the information that's available to them and can properly or improperly, I guess, attune to it. I think that we all have a heightened sense of awareness, whether we choose to pay attention to it or not, to see the underlying patterns in certain things. I have it as much as anyone else has it. I've never chosen to make it any larger than it already is.
So I love that there's a difference between awareness and sensitivity in your mind, that there is a very big void between awareness and sensitivity. Because think about that. You had mentioned that psychics are someone who's more aware, whereas a individual might be more sensitive, and that you are hypersensitive.
Yes.
So I also know that you're a kinesthetic person, so you're a touchy-feely person. So when you meet a person, Is it a more sexual experience? Is it a more touchy-feely experience? Is it a more flirtatious experience? What kind of an experience is it for you as someone who's more hypersensitive when meeting someone?
I think that because I understand who I am, upon first meeting, there's a natural inclination in me to make sure that I'm not overly touchy-feely with people, because I know that not everyone is like that. So there has to be a moment whether I figure out while I'm talking to them and listening to their words, figuring out if they're auditory or visual or kinesthetic, or auditory visual or visual kinesthetic, or trying to figure out who they are so I can match that to make them more comfortable, because then I'll be more comfortable, which is what I like, feeling comfortable.
Natural empathy, as it were, in someone who has a charm, a natural charm.
I have been called charming before.
Well, and even listening to you speak, for those of you listening and for those in the chat room streaming about just how wonderful your lectures are, and they always make you think, and that's the natural reflection of someone who's a very, very successful empath, which for me as a profiler, that's a very honed skill and or gift. It can be both, or it can be one or the other. I like learning which one it is, and I think most of us who are also empaths in our own right know instantly which one, if it's been a learned skill or a gift. It's kind of like a vampire seeing a vampire in another room. You know which one's been bitten and which one was, Stephen Dorff. Do you know what I mean?
Right. Yep. It's strange. It's for me, I'll tell you, I grew up, my family is very kinesthetic. My family always hugs. We always touch. It's always, we're very aware of each other all the time. We're always engaged in discourse, whether it be argumentative or not, but we love the exchange of ideas. And there was a part of me that was radically altered by my near-death experience that turned me into a more, being from the family that I was from, I was always about caring about what people thought and how they felt intellectually. It was my near-death experience that made me care about how people felt emotionally and spiritually.
Interesting. That you would be more selfless and more empathic in a way that was mutually beneficial.
Right.
See, that's where me, as someone who is assessing a psychopath, that's a very, very, very important root seed of information. To know.
Am I problematic now?
No. When the motivation is good, when you might have giveness and charm and all of these personality disorders of a factor one trait, that's okay. And when you also have behaviors that are, follow through with that charm, that's fine. It's when it becomes violent or selfish or psychopathic, I guess, that I get concerned. But no, there's no worry there. But I absolutely just love listening to you speak, and I love getting into your mind and understanding more about what you believe and what you think and the linguistics of it and just how important perspective is. And sadly, we're down to the last minute of the show.
Uh-oh.
I know, it's the music like Tetris speeds up in my mind.
That flew by, Sarah.
Yeah, I know. But where can people learn more about you, John?
It's easy. You can just Google Weird Lectures as one word. WeirdLectures.com is my website, but that's also my YouTube channel. And then John E.L. Tenney, my middle initials are E.L. That's what I am on Twitter, John E.L. Tenney on Instagram, John E.L. Tenney on Facebook. But usually if you just type Weird Lectures on Google, they can go right to where I'm at and see where I'm going to be. There's an events page on Weird Lectures. And
where are you going to be next?
I'm doing some events with Amy for Strange Escapes, so they can go to strange-escapes.com and see those events. I know some of them are sold out, but I always tell people to pay attention to the events page, because when October comes around, for every lecture or event that I do where there's a ticket price, in October, I do a free lecture to offset that. So all of a sudden, October will be a huge flurry of free little lectures all around.
Great.
Busy. Yeah.
Good. Well, good. I'm hoping that everyone listening is already going there. They've already gone to weirdlectures.com in their mind, and they're not going to forget that. They're going to check you out. And hopefully tell Amy Dush Garnett next time you talk to her that, especially when she's in Missouri, man, I grew up there. Come on. That on A Strange Escapes to bring Paranormal Sarah, and hopefully we'll meet in person because I just loved talking to you, John. John Tenney, everyone. Thank you for your time and your energy and your thoughts tonight. And for those of you listening on the Skeleton Key, you can archive and download anytime here on ParaMania. And we'll see you next week, Tuesday at 8 Central.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you for listening to the Skeleton Key. Join host Paranormal Sarah at her new day and time, Tuesdays, 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central, only on the ParaMania Radio Network.